Hello, welcome to the Voice of American Law Enforcement with your host, Randy Sutton, a 34-year police veteran, the author of A Cop's Life and the founder of the Wounded Blue, National Assistance and Support Organization for injured and disabled law enforcement officers. We are here. Thank you for joining us here at Red Voice Media. On this show, we're going to be talking about all things law enforcement, from news articles to commentary. And you're going to hear the unvarnished truth from me. Let's get right into it. Now, I didn't write this, but I sure as hell wish I had, because this is written by a man named John McNulty. I don't know who John McNulty is, but I could not agree with him more on a piece that he wrote called Kneeling. I'm going to read it to you because there's no way in the world I could have said it any better. Kneeling by John McNulty. I watched the Democratic leaders of Congress kneel in the halls of Congress for about 9 minutes for the death of a black man named George Floyd. I've never seen them kneel for a fallen police officer. I have never seen them kneel for a fallen soldier. I never saw them kneel for the soldiers that Hillary and Obama left to die in Benghazi. I have never seen them kneel for the thousands of black and white babies aborted every day. I have never seen them kneel for a murdered white man or woman. I have never seen them kneel for thousands of black on black murder victims. I have never seen them kneel for the thousands of elderly people that died in nursing homes due to the coronavirus, especially in New York. I have to ask, why are Democrats putting the life of George Floyd as more valuable than the lives of everyone else? In fact, Democrats have put so much value on the life of George Floyd, they have allowed rioting, looting, arson, murder, and mayhem in communities nationwide. Ask yourself, why now? The family, brother and sister of George Floyd, opened a GoFundMe account to, quote, help the family, unquote. It has already raised $14,455,000 and still counting from donations. Yes, almost $4.5 million for a guy that was arrested 9 times, was a convicted drug dealer, and had a drug deal the day he died, held a gun to the stomach of a pregnant woman while his 5 buddies robbed her home, did prison time 3 different times, totaling about 8 years, and obviously didn't learn from our penal system. And America is memorializing him by painting murals of the guy on the sides of buildings like he is a hero. Unbelievable. You got to be kidding me. Crime does pay. And to pour salt in the wound, Representative Pelosi presented his brother a folded American flag over the Capitol in his honor in a beautiful tri-cornered presentation case. And this was written by John McNulty. John, I haven't met you, but I couldn't agree more. Let's talk about this case. The trial is just about to start in Minneapolis. Unless you've been living under a rock, of course, you know that George Floyd died while resisting arrest from when he was approached by Minneapolis police in what is now an infamous piece of video. George Floyd's family got 14-some million dollars from a GoFundMe. Well, the day that the trial was supposed to get started, the day the jury pool was impaneled or beginning to be impaneled, the Minneapolis City Council voted to settle a lawsuit with his family for $27 million. $27 million. And this happened to be during the very same week when a jury was to be impaneled on the trial of the former officer who has been arrested in the case named Chauvin. Chauvin is one of several officers, but the one who this trial is centered upon. Now, let me ask you, do you think that this was a coincidence? That somehow on the very day that the jury pool is about to be questioned as if in order to determine who would be on the jury. Somehow the deal between the city of Minneapolis and the attorneys for the George Floyd family suddenly come to a settlement, which becomes international news. Well, here's the result of that. This is from a headline that just came out. Chauvin judge dismisses jurors after they say city's $27 million settlement confirmed cops' guilt. So, in other words, it's not bad enough that $27 million was handed to this family. It's not bad enough that a jury was not given the opportunity to listen to all of the facts in this case and then make a determination what the payment should be, if any. Instead, the Minneapolis City Council, who is unabashedly anti-law enforcement, who has made every effort to destroy the entire structure, not only structure, the entire police department in Minneapolis, who are consistently trying to dismantle that agency, suddenly they decide to hand over and fork over a $27 million settlement on the day that the jury is about to be impaneled. Can there be justice for this former officer who was involved in this arrest that resulted in the death of George Floyd? I don't think that it can happen at this point. And the Minneapolis City Council just added their efforts into what I believe is a travesty of justice. There has been such a effort at misinformation and disinformation concerning the true facts surrounding the death of George Floyd. The Minnesota Attorney General, from the very start, knew that this was going to be the highest profile case of his career that would result in an anti-law enforcement environment. And he's done everything possible to make sure that that happens. The facts that are going to be brought out in court, all the facts are exactly what needs to be observed, chronicled, and then a jury can make a decision about the guilt or innocence of the law enforcement officer. I believe that the civil case that resulted in this $27 million settlement, if justice were to be done there, then a jury should have been given all of the facts so that they could make a determination and let the chips fall where they may. But the Minneapolis City Council, in their zeal to destroy law enforcement and do everything in their power to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department, instead took that decision away from the people and gave it to themselves. This is an unfortunate new reality in law enforcement. This is part of the war on cops. What will happen in the Chauvin case remains to be seen. I will continue to report upon it here on the Voice of American Law Enforcement. Hello, I'm Randy Sutton. I'm the founder and national director of the Wounded Blue, the national assistance and support organization for injured and disabled law enforcement officers. We're a nationwide 501c3 charity that aids injured and disabled officers, whether those injuries are physical, emotional, or psychological. There is a crisis facing American law enforcement in today's society. The war on cops is very real. It's physical, it's emotional, it's social. There are many facets to it. And because of the violence that these men and women are facing every single day, injuries are mounting and mounting. Now, here's something that most people don't know, and that is that if you are injured in the line of duty, if you are severely injured, if you are disabled, your department may actually just toss you aside and throw you away. I know that that is a difficult concept to understand, but it's happening all over America. Imagine being shot in the head, as one Oklahoma officer was, and having your car repossessed, your house repossessed because your own department did not pay your medical bills. This is a reality. That's why our organization exists, to help these injured and disabled officers. I'm going to give you a startling statistic. 57,000 American law enforcement officers were physically assaulted just last year. Many of those assaults led to disabling injuries. These men and women need our help. They need your help. Please join us at thewoundedblue.org. That's thewoundedblue.org. See our film, which is on Amazon.com, called The Wounded Blue. And please do your best to help these men and women. They deserve it. In other news, I'm gonna read you a headline, and then we're gonna play a couple of videos for you, and then we're gonna get into this discussion. This is from the television show The View. Joy Behar has stated the violent left-wing group Antifa is a, quote, fictitious idea and not a real thing. Let's take a look at what she actually said, and then let's take a look at what Antifa really did. Amazing, is it not? Joy Behar, who uses her platform on television to espouse her political ideas, is so far out of touch with reality that it's almost, it would be laughable if it wasn't so sad. She's living in some denial, some weird utopian idea where she actually believes, I guess, that Antifa doesn't even exist, that it's a fictitious idea. For literally over a year, the men and women of the Portland Police Department have been almost in nightly combat. Hundreds of those officers have been injured in Portland alone, not to mention all of the other violent activities that have been attributed to this group from coast to coast. Hundreds of officers around the country have been injured in clashes with these men and women and people who dress up in their black clothing. They don all kinds of body armor, throw bricks and bottles and rocks, shoot at the police, and they do so in what is clearly an organized fashion. They bring with them weapons, they bring with them shields. It has been noted time after time. It has been chronicled by many, many sources, and yet Joy Behar doesn't want you to believe that. Joy Behar wants you to believe that they don't even exist, that it must be a figment of our imagination, that all of those videos that are out there that you just saw a little snippet of, those are just peaceful protesters. And it is this line of thinking, it is this mentality, it is this insanity that continues to enforce the realistic knowledge now that the people like Joy Behar simply don't want you to believe the truth. They want you to believe their political narrative. No matter how much damage, no matter how much destruction, no matter how much death it actually brings on law enforcement officers and the people of these communities that Antifa victimizes. This is just one of those Hollywood elitists that is safe in their own home, doesn't care about you. Joy Behar, I don't think she's going to invite me on the show. Just a guess. So an act of, I think, some good thought processes by a politician, which I don't have many good things to say, but I think something nice just came out of Florida. Florida governor proposes $1,000 bonuses for first responders. The one-time payments are part of Governor Ron DeSantis' proposal for spending Florida's share of the American Rescue Plan funds. I'm not even going to talk about this $1.7 trillion boondoggle that's been shoved down the throats of the American public, where literally pennies of it will actually go to COVID relief. I can't go there because my blood pressure will get too high. But Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has proposed $1,000 bonuses for first responders. He announced this, that he's estimating $10 million in federal stimulus funds will come to Florida. And here's what he said. We know that this pandemic put an awful lot of strain on our first responders, EMTs, sworn law enforcement firefighters. So we believe we should recognize their sacrifice over the last year. And that's when he announced that he's proposing this bonus payment. So, Governor DeSantis, big shout out to you. Thank you for caring. Thank you for not being afraid to show that you support first responders and law enforcement. I wish that many other governmental leaders would follow your lead, but I'm not going to be holding my breath. Now, on the other part of government and governors, this is really disturbing. This news report that came out of Richmond, Virginia. This is from the Police Tribune. Report: Virginia parole hearing illegally freed killers in secret parole meetings. Secret parole meetings. Tell me if this doesn't smack of some insidious plot. But it is Virginia. An investigation in the Virginia Parole Board that was launched by the state's watchdog agency after a cop killer was released without warning in April of 2020 found the parole board decisions violated the law on at least 8 other convicted killers that they paroled also. The Office of the State Inspector General began investigating after the Virginia Parole Board released a killer who murdered a 23-year Richmond police officer during a traffic stop without giving anyone a chance to object. The late Richmond police officer, Michael Connor, stopped a car for traveling the wrong way on a one-way street, 2 o'clock in the morning. He did not know the occupants of the vehicle had just committed an armed robbery. Testimony at trial revealed that the officer approached the car and that 23-year-old Vincent Lamont Martin got out of the vehicle. The officer told him to get back in. Martin drew a handgun and shot the officer in the neck. Testimony revealed that after the officer fell to the ground, Martin stood over him and shot him in the head 4 times. Martin was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death, but he appealed on a technicality and was granted a new trial. The second jury also convicted him of capital murder, but they gave him life in prison instead of the death penalty. Now, this guy applied for parole numerous times, was turned down, and then suddenly, in 2020, they released him after a super majority. And they were supposed to notify the family. They were supposed to notify law enforcement so that they could object. And they didn't do it. And it turns out that they didn't do it on 8 other occasions as well. And these were for violent murderers. So the brunt of the criticism has been leveled at former parole board chair Adrian Bennett, who left the board just 6 days after Martin was released on April 16, 2020. Bennett has been specifically named in at least 3 reports. She left the Virginia Parole Board to become a judge. Oh my God. She's now a judge. How scary is this? And Virginia governor, his chief of staff, Clark Mercer, called the inspector general's findings lacking objectivity. And Jeffrey Brett, the attorney for the former parole board chair, said the same thing. I know that's a shock. I think you'll find there are lots of facts being twisted. I think you'll find the agenda, which has heretofore caused more political stories than facts, need to have an investigation, and we look forward to it. Well, the investigation has already taken place. The Office of the Inspector General already did the investigation. They found the wrongdoing. And you know what? Here's something interesting. The Inspector General has stated this, that there should be misdemeanor criminal charges filed against the former parole board chair. Now, given what the governor said about the misinformation and politics, my guess is that this parole board member, who is now a judge, is going to skate completely. You know, what's interesting is there are constant calls for police accountability. The police got to be held accountable for their decisions. Who's holding people like that accountable? Anybody? No, nobody. The fox is in the hen house. Well, there's a lot more that we could talk about, but I think we're running out of time. As you can see, I have a bunch of stuff, but you know what? We're going to save that for next week. We've got somebody waiting in the interview room that I think you're really going to enjoy. So let's take a walk in the interview room, and we'll talk about the news again next week. Thanks. I have a special guest with me today in the what we are calling the interview room of the Voice of American Law Enforcement. His name is Josh Marquis, and he is the Director of Legal Affairs for Animal Wellness Action, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preventing cruelty to animals by promoting, enacting, and enforcing good public policy. He was appointed a circuit judge pro tem from the Oregon Supreme Court for a term from 2019 to 2022. From March 1994 through December of 2018, he was the district attorney of Clatsop County, Astoria, Oregon, and was active in both the National and the Oregon District Attorneys Association, as well as the International Association of Prosecutors, the Animal, and the National Law Enforcement Council of the Humane Society. He writes and speaks on matters of criminal justice and the nature of the relationship between popular culture, the media, and the law. Josh, thank you so much for joining me here at the Voice of American Law Enforcement.
Thanks for having me.
All right, there's so much happening, Josh, in the world of law enforcement, especially when it comes down to district attorneys. Now, you have been a district attorney for many, many years. If you would, tell us a little bit about your district attorney history, and then we're going to get into the reason for some of the actions or maybe inactions of district attorneys across the United States on a level that we have never seen before.
Sure. You mean my personal history as a district attorney, or how DAs?
Yeah, let's talk about what your personal history is.
Okay. I went to undergraduate school at the University of Oregon, and while I was there, I was a student journalist. And I was there in the early 1970s when there were riots on the campus. What's old is new again. On the riots in Eugene, Oregon, and I started covering the riots, and I found myself more sympathetic with the police than the rioters, having previously demonstrated against the war in Vietnam 5-6 years earlier. And from that, I ended up getting a volunteer job at the district attorney's office in 1973 before I could even drink, and I worked that into a part-time job as an investigator. I worked several years as an investigator. Then I went to law school because I got tired of taking crap from the lawyers. So I thought, well, if they go to law school, I can go to law school. So I did. I became a deputy DA in 1981. I stayed in Eugene for probably about 3 or 4 years. I went to the California Department of Justice and worked on the executive staff of the then California Attorney General. And then I came back to Oregon and was a deputy DA and chief deputy DA on a coastal town about 100 miles south of where I live now, Newport, Oregon. And then I briefly went into private practice for about a year and a half where I actually defended murderers and child molesters. I didn't like that very much. So when a chief deputy DA job came open in Bend, Oregon in 1990, I applied and got it. And I did that job for about 4 years. And then the position I held for 25 years became open because my predecessor was arrested and indicted for framing two innocent police officers on phony drug charges when they wouldn't dismiss
Wow.
a traffic citation against her boyfriend. So my job became open because she was convicted of a crime and recalled from office. And I ran the first time in 1994 and then 6 more times until 2 years ago when I decided that 25 years was enough.
I think I can understand it. So 25 years as a district attorney. You were also active in the State District Attorneys Association and National District Attorneys Association. So you have a wide breadth of experience.
I do, and
I've
been fortunate when I was in the National DAs Association for over 20 years. I did a great deal of public speaking and traveling around the country. One of the things in government that can make you parochial is that you tend to stay where you are. And frankly, sometimes in law enforcement that happens. You don't have a lot of opportunities normally to maybe travel within the state, but rarely outside. But I was very lucky. I spoke all over the United States. I did trainings, I did speeches. So I've really had a chance, at least in the 21st century, to see how it's working or not working all over America.
Okay, so let's talk about this. You're in a state that is exceedingly liberal. Now, what we have seen,
it's not as much as.
Let me get to the question. Let me get to the question. You're in a state that has seen a lot of liberal actions being taken, and there have been district attorneys, especially in Multnomah County, who have become, let's say, activists, and not in activists in the way of supporting law enforcement and actually prosecuting criminality, but just the opposite. So my question to you is, what is going on in this on a national level where we have seen such an influx of district attorneys and prosecutors that have seemed to be taking on the role of anti-law enforcement activism?
It's been really scary, and I've been writing about it for over 10 years. Prosecutors in America are supposed to be pretty much apolitical. I've always been a Democrat, but I always ran as a nonpartisan, and that's the way it should be. You should not be tied to a political party or an ideology. Police officers know this. I mean, you do not wear your opinions on your sleeve. Starting about probably 5 or 6 years ago, about 2015, George Soros and his vast interlocking empire of the Open Society Institute, which spawns all these other small organizations, but is fed by huge amounts of money, started deciding to squirrel out and try to take over elective offices. They were not very successful until very recently, about 2018. They defeated, for example, a wonderful DA, happened to be an Hispanic woman in Chicago, and elected a woman named Kim Foxx, who unfortunately just got reelected. She's sort of an anti-prosecutor. So is the DA in Philadelphia. In one of the most ironic races, the largest DA's office in the United States, in the world, in fact, is the Los Angeles County DA's office. For the last 8 years, the DA was a black woman named Jackie Lacey, great prosecutor, career prosecutor, and a white guy sponsored by the Soros people named George Gascon runs against her, basically backed by huge Hollywood money and Soros, and evicts a black woman from the working class suburbs of Los Angeles on the grounds that she's not woke enough. San Francisco has always been a train wreck, but it's a particularly bad one now. Chaz Boudin, who is the district attorney there, both of his parents are convicted murderers. One of them will always be in prison. He goes to visit his dad, and his mother got out. So this is very, very concerning. You have a targeted effort by, I don't call them liberal, they're radical groups that fundamentally do not believe in law enforcement at all. I wouldn't be a good public defender. I spent a year doing criminal defense work and I didn't like it. And there's nothing wrong with it. But there's something, and we're seeing this play out in counties where you have these woke DAs because they don't want to prosecute. That's what's happening in Portland. Cases just aren't happening. They're being pled down. This is happening in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Marilyn Mosby, notoriously incompetent district attorney. But they're not measuring themselves by how safe the community is or whether they secure convictions. They're measuring themselves by how much they appease essentially their radical base, which may not live even in their community, that's saying you must address the societal issues.
All right, let me stop you there. So basically what we're seeing is nationally, the largest prosecutor's office, district attorney's office around the country. You named a few of them. St. Louis, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, around the country. Suddenly, in the last few years, a radical element of district attorney coming into office. And here's what one of the consternations that I feel is they seem to have unlimited power when it comes down to who they prosecute, why they prosecute, and how they prosecute. Are there no federal standards? Are there no national standards that they can be held accountable to?
No, not really. I guess when I was a district attorney and an assistant district attorney for 15 years before the 25 I was DA, I resisted claims that prosecutors were really very powerful. I now realize that I probably was. The American system, which is radically different than the European, which I've experienced as living overseas and talking. I was on the International Association of Prosecutors, and they all look at us overseas like we're crazy. The idea of electing a prosecutor strikes them as the craziest idea they've ever heard of. But it's a really uniquely American idea, and it's the idea that we marry justice and democracy together, that it isn't just come down on high. So to answer your question about, well, isn't there some, overriding, mechanism that will override these people who essentially ignore the law and just say, well, I'm just not going to do that. And the short answer is no, because what we've always believed in America is a highly decentralized system. The FBI has only been in existence for, 60, 70 years, and it was controversial. The idea of a national police force is abhorred, both by local police largely and constitutional scholars. So no, and when you go to foreign countries, even countries that are like us in many ways, like Britain or Western Europe, they're astonished at our system of justice. They're used to a highly centralized system where you have an attorney general or a minister of justice, and then they appoint down, and then they might have someone like me appointed at the local level, but I would in turn answer to somebody higher and higher and higher. That's just totally outside the American experience. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But what we've seen with Soros and local DAs is the corruption of money and the corruption of media, which is not nearly as free as it used to be. And when you walk into a community, any community in America, and you outspend the other side by a ratio of 100 to 1 in advertising, unless it's a topic that the public really, really knows about, and there are very few of those, you are going to overwhelm your opponent every time.
All right, so let's look at Portland. The unrest in Portland, the violence, the destruction of the city has been taking place well over 6 months. I think we're approaching a year now, where there's almost nightly riots, destruction, vandalism, arson. Just recently, in the last week or so, the barriers that were erected to keep the federal courthouse at least from being burned to the ground and vandalized every single night were removed. Those barriers, once they were removed, gave access to the building once again after a period of about 8 or 9 months, and it only took days before it was attacked again. So the resulting arrests that are taking place, it is up to the district attorney to make the determination to prosecute rioters. The district attorney in Multnomah County, who was elected under the platform that we're just discussing, that is a radical platform of basically not prosecuting people, has an open door, revolving door policy, and this has become a major issue facing the Portland police. What is there an answer here?
Well, district attorneys are elected, and the legal system only works when the parts of it that are supposed to be pushing on their respective ends of it, sort of think about when you're making a bed, you have to pull the sheets across and tuck them into the 4 points of the bed. Well, think of a criminal justice system where one side just says, I give up, I'm going to throw my sheet of the bed up. It won't work. You expect public defenders to do their job, to be aggressive, to go out and challenge cops and challenge DAs. But by the same token, you need prosecutors. If they don't believe in the law, what are they doing there? I mean, essentially and some of these people are more blatant in what their motive is. They want to deconstruct the system. They want to ruin it. They want to bring it down. Larry Krasner, the DA in Philadelphia, is one of the worst. I mean, his intention is to essentially degrade and destroy law enforcement. Now, I believe in the electoral system. I believe in electing DAs. I've had interesting conversations with people about, well, would I be able to be reelected feeling as strongly and speaking out as strongly as I did now? I don't know. I think I probably would in my county. I don't think I would be able to have been elected in Portland, but frankly, I might never have been able to get elected in Portland. But what's happening in Portland is it's my big city. It's where I go to, take my wife for a really nice dinner and we stay and go shopping. It's almost impossible to describe. And I've lived overseas. I've been to China and Russia. I've seen some pretty abysmal poverty. And Portland is being ruined, just like San Francisco and Seattle, and all the same ingredients are there. Because if you don't have someone in the district attorney's chair who is pushing back and saying, no more, we are not going to put up with this. The broken window theory, which has been ridiculed by ultra liberals for years, turns out to be exactly right. If you let the little stuff go, it turns into the big stuff. And all you have to do is you can go on YouTube and see drive-throughs of Portland. It starts with trash, garbage everywhere. I mean, my wife and I were just getting our second COVID vaccine weekend before last, and it's just staggering. And you can tie it directly to the action or inaction of this district attorney who says, I'm not going to prosecute victimless crimes. I'm not going to prosecute thefts. I'm not going to prosecute tagging. I'm not going to prosecute drug possession. I mean, at some point, it doesn't take long. The word gets out, and the people I feel sorriest for are the uniformed officers of the Portland Police Bureau, because they're out there in a uniform as a target, being literally abused constantly. I mean, when I worked in law enforcement, when I was closer to the street level, I cannot imagine officers having to take the kind of abuse that they did. And most civilians have no idea what these officers have to put up with. And the fact that they're not even allowed, to relent or react in any way. And then they turn around and they make an arrest. 80% of them are not filed. They get attacked by a civilian. I mean, just really attacked. I'm sure you've seen videos. And not only do they not file the charges, but they often manufacture that as a charge against the officer. I mean, some of me doesn't understand why entire city police departments in places like Minneapolis and Portland don't just lay their badges on the desk and walk out the door.
Yeah. The this new national trend, if you will, has got to be costing millions and millions and millions of dollars to put into place. These district attorneys, I view them as quite literally Trojan horses that are being put into place by the puppet master. And as we know, George Soros, and through all of his derivatives and the organizations that he funds, has been highly effective in putting into place these activist district attorneys. I'm only using the word activist because I'm being polite. I don't really want to use that word. There are several others I would like to be using, but here's what's happening: the degrading of the entire criminal justice system is now in full swing. Is there a way to combat this on some level that would have a coherent way forward to bring back values that I cannot believe that most Americans believe in these tactics that are being used in these major cities by these district attorneys, which are basically leaving the citizens vulnerable to crime and making the streets literally a bloodbath in certain areas of the country. What is there to be done in order to combat this?
Well, I think a couple of things. One of the things over my 40-year career as a prosecutor was that I found that many of my colleagues were very unwilling to speak out. And that's how I differentiated myself. I was always loud and annoying and controversial. And it cost me at a couple of places. I was very close to being appointed United States Attorney, and my local senators, U.S. senators, supported me. But when I got back to Washington, I had made enough noise that somebody in D.C. just crossed me off the list. That's fine. I'm just saying that we need people in my position and in other political positions to be willing to speak out. We need citizens to be willing to speak out. I can, in just my lifetime, my professional lifetime, I can remember when citizens made a difference and line police officers. Just let's go back to the late 70s, early 80s. Drunk driving up until about 1979 was considered a joke. Some of your older viewers may remember a comedian named Foster Brooks. He used to appear on Johnny Carson. That's how long ago this was. And his whole shtick was about being a drunk. And it would be, I was the tree chasing me down the street. And it was very funny. Drunk driving was a joke. And it fit into popular culture that way. Well, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers and a woman named Candy Lightner changed that. And we can see within our lifetimes a change in the way drunk driving was treated. You can peg that with domestic violence. It used to be a joke to say, I'm going to beat my wife till she bleeds. Not funny anymore. Sexual child abuse. I think most people don't even want to talk about it, so it's hard to get it. And in fact, what I'm involved in now is animal cruelty. A lot of people don't like to talk about it. I don't think it's not as huge an issue as, say, drunk driving or some of these other things. But my point is that one of the good things about America is we do have access to the political levers. People have got to speak out, and they can't be cowed by claims that you're politically incorrect. Now, this is easy for me to say as a retired district attorney who is never going to face the voters again. But I've been testifying by this method in the Oregon legislature, and people are terrified. And even though Oregon is not a very diverse state, approximately 6% of the population is Black, maybe 10 or 12% Hispanic, but everything is being defined through race. And that's the excuse for getting rid of truth in sentencing, because in their argument, the very small African American population in Oregon is overrepresented in prisons, which is true. There's about 6% African American in the state. About 9% of the inmates are. Now, they say ipso facto that must mean the laws or the enforcement of it are racist. No, the other possibility is for a whole bunch of complex reasons that in that community, more of the crimes where people are being caught are committed by young black men and young white men. You were a police officer. The last people you ever want to see on the street are young men of any race between the ages of 18 and 25 using drugs or alcohol, and worse yet, having a weapon. Jesse Jackson was famously said, it's almost 30 years now, when he was running for president against Clinton in the primaries, that if he was walking down the street in Chicago and saw a group of young black men on the street, he'd cross to the other side. It's a very controversial comment, and he didn't repeat it many times, but he was articulating something that we people just didn't dare speak about. We've got to be able to have honest conversations about race without immediately dropping to one knee and apologizing. It's doing an incredible disservice to everyone, including the communities of color that are way overrepresented as victims of crime. But just in my little world of Oregon, when I go to testify about sentencing laws, I'm immediately smacked in the face with the claim that I'm being a racist, even though, as I said, less than 3% of the state is black, and less than 10% of the prisoners are black.
So let's look at what's taking place in Los Angeles right now. There is this activist. I mean, I think Gascon is probably one of the worst case scenarios of a district attorney being elected who has an agenda that is as radical gets, including not even allowing the laws to be utilized to put people into prison. He's doing everything possible to give the lightest sentence imaginable on every single crime. But he's only been in office since January, and his radical policies are literally on the news almost every day. At this point, there's even a recall effort that is being spoken about. I don't think I've ever heard of this happening before. Have you?
No, actually, I'm from Los Angeles originally, and I've given money to the recall group, and I'm on that. There's 38,000 members of the Facebook group called Recall George Gascon. Like I said, the previous DA was a friend of mine. Actually, several LA DAs have been friends of mine over the decades, and he's absolutely the worst. I mean, if you knew his background, you wouldn't think that. He was a beat officer in the LA Police Department. Many people will remember his face from 1995 when he went on TV when O.J. Simpson started running. And the person you see is a guy wearing a crisp uniform and 1 star of a commander, which is the LAPD rank he held, where he says, O.J. Simpson is now a fugitive. Most people kind of remember that. That was Gascon's first moment in the sun. And then he rose a couple more clicks, got a couple more stars in LA. Then he moved to San Francisco. Then he went to another place to be chief. Then he went to law school, moved to San Francisco, became the San Francisco DA, and then decided that he was going to move back to LA and was underwritten. And he's terrible because he's done things like order deputy DAs to not show up at parole hearings to assist victims when people convicted of horrible multiple murders are trying to get out. There have been scenes in court that I've actually seen, as well as being recorded, where the two sides, many cops will know this scene. You know, you have a judge and there's a pretrial hearing, a prosecutor on one side, defense attorney on the other. So somebody from Gascon's office comes off, doesn't run up to the prosecutor, runs up to the defense attorney, cuddles with them, and at which point the defense attorney says, well, I'm informed that the administration of the DA's office is willing to reduce this even further. I mean, the one thing about LA people should know, particularly people who watch your podcast, because you have a lot of law enforcement officers, is in LA, the deputy DAs are civil service. It is very hard to fire them. A lot of these people will find themselves in Lancaster doing traffic court, which is not where I'd want to be in LA. But he can't really fire a career deputy DA. And the Association of Assistant District Attorneys in LA County is really aggressive. They filed motions in court to block him from doing some of this stuff. But ultimately, it's political. It will come down to whether my mother and sister both live in Los Angeles County, and I pleaded with them to vote for Jackie Lacey. My mother did, but I couldn't convince my sister to.
It's amazing. It's amazing that the people who are going to be the potential victims, the people whose literal safety is on the line, would embrace a radical district attorney who has such an immense power when it comes down to their safety. To me it's mind-boggling. I can't wrap my head around it, but we're seeing this in city after city after city, and I just hope that it's going to be exactly what you said. The citizens have to wake up. They have to see, and they have to become activists themselves for their own safety and the safety of their cities.
Well, I'm a political junkie, and I actually waded through the maps of the 2020 election for district attorney in LA County because I was curious to see. And I lived down there a long time. I worked for the attorney general. I was a newspaper reporter, and it was very interesting. The highest vote totals for Gascon were in very wealthy white neighborhoods. There's essentially almost a disconnect. I mean, if you live in Hancock Park, or I can think of any number of places in Los Angeles where, you probably have private security on top of which you have, there's a lot of other social factors that keep other people away. So they're at less risk. My parents, my father's has died, but my mother still lives there. They live in a very upper middle class community in Southern California, and they've never been threatened by crime in any way. And they live on a private street in a town that's up against the mountains. So in fairness, many of these people, it has never come home to them. They, the kinds of things that you talk about on your show and you did in your career are utterly alien to them. It's one of the reasons, frankly, that cop shows have always been interesting. They're so exotic to most people. For people in law enforcement, it's like, what's so romantic about, roll call and, the particular smells that you get when you're at 3 o'clock in the morning and rolling some guy over to try to find his ID. There's nothing romantic about it. But, I think there will come a time when people are fascinated with it again. But really, unfortunately, this has to be a political change. We have to be able to be willing to talk about race in a rational and decent way. We have to be willing to factor in the enormous effect of money, because that's how this has almost always happened everywhere. The two things are race and money. That's what's caused every single one of these DA races. You don't have time, and your viewers probably don't have the interest, but I could deconstruct almost every one of those DA elections from, Philadelphia to Chicago to Baltimore to Portland to San Francisco to LA. And they're all not exactly the same dynamic, but they're very similar. But again, at the end of the day, who can change this? The voters can. They just have to not be afraid to ask these questions. For example, here's a simple one. Why is the homicide rate in most American cities at a 30-year high?
Right.
Particularly in those communities that have been controlled for 2-4 years by woke DAs, like Philadelphia, San Francisco.
Exactly.
How do you account?
And until those questions are being asked, until those questions are seriously being asked by the voters, we're not going to see a change. We're going to have to leave it there. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. But I really want to take the opportunity to thank you for taking the time and sharing your experience and your wisdom on what I think is a critical topic concerning the public safety of Americans.
Thank you, Randy.
All over the country. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Each week here on the Voice of American Law Enforcement, we believe that it's important to honor the lives of the men and women of the law enforcement profession who have made the ultimate sacrifice and given their lives in the line of duty. Each week, we will read the names of the officers who died the previous week. Unfortunately, I have several names to read this week. The first is Police Officer Gary Hibbs of the Chicago Heights Police Department in Illinois. Police Officer Gary Hibbs suffered a fatal heart attack while attempting to arrest a subject in an apartment on 14th Place. He and other officers had responded to the apartment on March 4th, 2021, to investigate a domestic violence call. During the investigation, he attempted to place the subject under arrest, but the man resisted and began fighting with him. Officer Hibbs collapsed during the struggle. Officer Hibbs was transported to Franciscan Hospital, where he remained until passing away on March 12, 2021. Officer Hibbs has served with the Chicago Heights Police Department for 25 years. His son also serves as a police officer with his agency. Police Officer Gary Hibbs, Chicago Heights Police Department, Illinois. End of watch Friday, March 12th, 2021. The next is Police Officer Kevin Valencia of the Orlando Police Department in Florida. Police Officer Kevin Valencia succumbed to complications of gunshot wounds sustained on June 11th, 2018, while responding to a domestic disturbance on Eaglesmere Drive. A convicted felon who was on probation for arson was holding his two children and his girlfriend's two children in the apartment. The man's girlfriend had called the police following an argument in which the man assaulted her. Officer Valencia was attempting to gain entry into the apartment to retrieve the children when the man fired through the front door, striking him in the head. The man then barricaded himself inside of the apartment for several hours until ultimately he murdered all four children, ranging in age 1 to 12, before committing suicide. Officer Valencia is survived by his wife, two children. Police Officer Kevin Valencia, Orlando Police Department, Florida. End of watch, Monday, March 15th, 2021. The next officer is Border Patrol Agent Alejandro Flores Benuelos of the Border Patrol. Border Patrol Agent Alejandro Flores Benuelos was struck and killed by a vehicle on Highway 86 north of Marina Drive in Salt City, California. He was the first to arrive at the scene of a vehicle crash that occurred during a dust storm that caused low visibility. He was assisting an elderly patient who was still in her car when another vehicle struck him and the car. Agent Flores Benuelos was transported to Pioneers Memorial Hospital, where he succumbed to his injuries. Agent Flores Benuelos was a U.S. Marine Corps veteran and had served with the United States Border Patrol for 12 years. He is survived by his expectant wife and 3 children. Border Patrol Agent Alejandro Flores Benuelos, United States Department of Homeland Security. End of watch, Monday, March 15th, 2021. Each of these law enforcement officers gave their lives serving the people of their communities and their country. May they rest in peace. Thanks so much for joining me here at the Voice of American Law Enforcement. On this show, we want to bring the truth about the American law enforcement officer to you, the American public. You can find me at the Voice of American Law Enforcement on Facebook. If you have suggestions, you have comments, find me there. We'll see you again next week, right here on the Voice of American Law Enforcement. This is Randy Sutton. Thank you.